The wind carried the scent of dust, gunpowder, and dry mesquite through the canyons of the Arizona Territory. The sun hung low and harsh, painting everything in gold and shadow, while the cries of hawks circled above the dead land. From the porch of a ranch house built on sweat and pride, she stood watching her brothers saddle their horses. Their rifles glimmered under the sun. Their eyes burned with the thrill of the hunt. They were chasing the most wanted Apache in the territory, a man whose name had become a whisper of fear and defiance across every frontier town. She had grown up hearing stories about him, how he raided the ranches of settlers, how he vanished into the desert like a ghost, how soldiers chased him for years and never caught more than his tracks. They said he killed without mercy, that his arrows spoke quicker than guns, that the desert itself shielded him. But no one ever told the story of why he fought. To her family, he was just an enemy, a savage outlaw. To her, he was a mystery wrapped in dust and silence. Her father had lost cattle to Apache raids, and her older brother had sworn vengeance after a man from their town was found with arrows in his back. For months, the talk around supper had turned to blood. "We'll catch him one day," her father said, eyes fixed on the flames. "That Apache devil will hang." She never spoke during those talks. She'd sit near the window, her hands cold, listening to the desert wind, as if it carried another side of the story no one cared to hear. That morning, she watched them ride out, her father, her brothers, a few men from the neighboring ranch. Dust rose behind them like smoke as they disappeared into the wild. She wanted to believe the things they said about him, but something in her heart refused. Maybe it was the way the land changed when his name was mentioned, the way silence followed. Like even the desert feared to echo it. Days passed without word. The house grew empty and restless. She tended to the horses, gathered firewood, and tried to ignore the dread that came with every sunset. Then, one night, the sound of hoofbeats broke the stillness. The men returned, bruised, silent, carrying one of their own wrapped in a blanket. Brother's blood had dried dark over his shirt. No one spoke his name. Her father's face was a storm. "He'll pay for this," he said, voice shaking with rage. "If I have to burn half this land to find him, he'll pay." That night, she sat alone in the barn, her hands trembling as she brushed the mare that her brother used to ride. The air was heavy with dust and grief. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote howled, and her eyes filled with tears. She didn't know who was right anymore. Her family spoke of justice, but it sounded too much like revenge. She wanted to believe in goodness, in reason, but out here on the frontier, men carried truth in their rifles. When dawn came, the hunt resumed. The men rode out again, their faces harder than stone. This time, she followed quietly, at a distance, her heart a tangle of fear and curiosity. The trail led into the Badlands, through ravines and narrow passes, where the heat shimmered like smoke. She saw the signs, boot tracks, horse prints, and once, the faint mark of bare feet. She realized he was close. As the sun dropped behind the cliffs, the men spread out, forming a line. Then came a gunshot, sharp and echoing. Horses screamed, men shouted. She ducked behind a boulder, her breath caught in her throat. When the dust cleared, one of the men lay still, an arrow through his chest. Another shouted that he saw him, the Apache, running through the rocks like a shadow. They chased him until the darkness swallowed everything. She never saw his face that day. Only the movement, quick, precise, and almost inhuman. That image burned into her mind. Days turned into weeks. The men kept hunting, but she started noticing things around the ranch, small signs that someone had been near. A water bucket left half full. Footprints near the creek. Once, she found a broken arrow tip wedged in the woodpile. She should have told her father, but something in her wouldn't let her. Instead, she began to leave small things outside, a canteen, a piece of bread, once even a blanket. She told herself it was nothing, that perhaps some traveler would find it. But deep down she knew who might. The nights grew colder. Coyotes roamed closer. And one night, when the wind howled through the hills, she heard something outside, not the call of an animal, but the slow, steady sound of footsteps. Her heart pounded. She reached for her lamp, the light trembling in her hand. The door creaked, and in the shadows stood a man, tall, silent, his face half covered in dirt and blood. His dark eyes met hers, fierce yet calm, and for a moment the world froze. He didn't raise a weapon, he didn't speak. He just looked at her, breathing hard, as if deciding whether she was friend or foe. She saw the arrow wound on his shoulder, the dried blood down his arm. "You're hurt." He hesitated, watching her every move, ready to vanish if she made a sound. When he finally stepped into the light, she saw the truth. Not the monster they spoke of, but a man with eyes full of loss and exhaustion. His skin bore the marks of the sun, his chest the scars of battles fought for something more than survival. She cleaned his wound in silence. He winced but said nothing. When she asked softly, "Why do you keep fighting?" his gaze lifted to the door. "Because they took everything," he said, voice low and steady. She didn't ask who they were. She already knew. When dawn broke, he was gone. The bandage lay folded neatly by the door, and the water jug was empty. But something in her heart had shifted. Yet she couldn't stop thinking about him, the man her family hunted, the one she now saw as human. That evening, as she walked to the creek, she noticed smoke rising in the distance, the signal her father used when they found a trail. The wind carried the faint sound of gunfire, echoing across the canyon. Panic gripped her. She ran, stumbling over rocks and dry brush until she reached the ridge. From there, she saw flames licking the edge of a camp below. Her father and the others had cornered someone near the rocks. Then, a shot rang out. The next sound was a scream, not from the Apache, but from one of her own. Her father shouted orders, but the desert swallowed his words. She took one step down the slope, then another, until the ground gave way beneath her. She fell hard, tumbling through the dust and brush, hitting a rock. Pain shot through her leg. She tried to stand, but the world spun. The sound of battle faded into silence. The only thing she heard was the crackle of fire in her own heartbeat, and then, through the haze, a shadow appeared. Bare feet, a bow in hand. The man her family had hunted for months stood over her, his face streaked with dirt and blood, his eyes burning with something between fury and pity. He knelt beside her, studied her face for a long moment, and said quietly, "You shouldn't have come here." Before she could speak, he lifted her gently, his arms steady around her shoulders, and carried her into the dark, away from the burning camp, away from the world she thought she knew. Somewhere behind them, the fire rose higher, painting the night sky red. And she realized, trembling in his arms, that the man her family swore to kill was the one who had just saved her life. The desert night wrapped around them like a blanket of silence. The only sound was the faint rattle of the wind brushing through the sagebrush and the steady beat of his footsteps against the hard earth. She could hear his breathing, slow but deep, as he carried her farther away from the flames that had once marked her home. The smell of smoke and burnt wood lingered in the air, mixing with the sharp scent of blood and sweat. Every step reminded her that the world she had known was gone, and the man her family called a killer was the only one keeping her alive. He set her down beside a narrow stream that wound through a canyon hidden from the open plain. The moonlight shimmered faintly on the water, and she realized how carefully he had chosen the place. The rocks around them made it hard for anyone to track or ambush them. His every movement showed a knowledge of the land that seemed almost instinctive. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry, and when she did, her voice came out as a whisper. "Why did you save me?" He didn't answer right away. He tore a strip of cloth from his shirt and dipped it in the water before wrapping it gently around her leg where the rock had cut deep. "You would have died there," he said finally, his voice low, almost unreadable. "You're not meant to die with their guns." She didn't know what he meant. Their guns, her family's guns, like the men who raised her, who taught her that people like him were the enemy. She wanted to argue to say he didn't know them, but as she looked into his eyes under the faint moonlight, something in her faltered. There was no hatred in his expression, just a deep, quiet sadness, like a man who had already lost more than he could ever say. They stayed by the stream until morning. When the sun began to rise, its light painted the canyon walls in shades of red and gold. She could see the lines of exhaustion on his face, the faint tremor in his hands. He had been hunted for too long. She could feel it, the weight of endless days hiding, running, surviving. "My family will come for me," she said, her voice steadier now. "They'll think you kidnapped me." He met her gaze calmly. "Then they will find tracks," he said, "but they will not find you where they expect." He began gathering dry brush for a fire, his movements precise, deliberate. "You can go back when the sun falls. You'll find the road east." She watched him light the fire with a flint stone. The sparks caught quickly, flickering against his scarred hands. There was something strange about the way he spoke, not like a man running for his life, but one who had already accepted that he had nowhere left to run. When the flames warmed her fingers, she finally asked the question that had haunted her since the night began. "Why do they say you're wanted? What did you do?" Stared into the fire for a long time before answering. "Your people came to our valley," he said quietly. "They built houses where my people buried their dead. They cut down the trees that gave us shade. When we asked them to stop, they brought soldiers." She felt her chest tighten. No one had told her that part. She had grown up hearing that the Apaches attacked first, that they stole cattle and burned homes. She had never been told about land or graves or the soldiers. He looked at her again, eyes steady. "They call me outlaw because I fought back. I took their horses, their guns, made them remember that this land was not empty." His tone didn't carry pride or anger, just truth, spoken like a memory too heavy to forget. She wanted to say something, to tell him that not all settlers were cruel, that her family only wanted to survive too. But the words caught in her throat. Deep inside, she knew survival had a different meaning for people like him. When the day grew hot, he rose and scanned the horizon. The stillness in his body reminded her of a hawk watching the plain. "They'll come before sundown," he said. "Your father will follow the tracks. He won't stop until he finds me." She felt a rush of fear. "And let me talk to him," she pleaded. "If he sees I'm safe, maybe he'll let you go." He shook his head. "He won't see you as safe until I'm dead." He picked up his bow and slung it across his back. "But there's a place not far from here, a cave behind the canyon. You'll stay there until dark." She wanted to argue, to ask him what he would do, but before she could speak, he was already moving quiet as wind, deliberate as the land itself. As the hours passed, the heat pressed down heavy. She waited in the shadow of the cave, listening to the hum of insects and the faint trickle of the stream below. Her thoughts wandered back to her family, her father's anger, her brother's pride, the promises of revenge. They had built their lives on the belief that strength came from dominance, that justice came through the barrel of a gun. But here, hidden among rocks and silence, she began to see how fragile that belief really was. Every sound outside made her flinch, the snap of a twig, the cry of a hawk. Once, she thought she heard a horse. But when she stepped toward the cave's entrance, she saw him returning, his hair loose in the wind, a cut across his chest, and a look that told her he'd seen something she didn't want to know. "They're close," he said. "Your father's men are on the ridge." Her heart pounded. "Then we should go." He didn't move. "If we run, they'll follow. They'll shoot before they see who's beside me." "Then hide," she said desperately. "I'll tell them I was lost, that I fell and you helped me." He gave a faint, tired smile. "Would you lie for me?" She didn't answer. The truth pressed against her ribs. Yes, she would. Because the thought of them killing him now, after he had saved her, felt like something she couldn't bear. He turned toward the edge of the canyon, where the sun was bleeding into the sky. The light caught the copper beads in his hair, making them glint like fire. "They will come down soon," he said. "Stay here." Before she could stop him, he was gone again, moving toward the rocks that overlooked the valley. She crawled to the entrance and watched, her breath caught. Where she sat, she could see the riders in the distance, 5 of them, her father among them, his rifle resting across his saddle. They were scanning the ground, searching for tracks. He crouched among the stones, watching them in silence. For a moment, she thought he might attack, but instead he waited, as if testing fate itself. The wind carried her father's voice faintly, orders shouted, the clatter of reins. Then one of the men pointed. Her heart stopped. They had seen something. Within seconds, rifles were raised. She wanted to scream, to warn him, but her voice wouldn't come. The first shot echoed through the canyon, scattering the birds from the cliffs. He dropped low, rolling behind a boulder, the dust rising around him. Another shot followed. She couldn't breathe. She could see the muzzle flashes, the smoke curling in the light. He drew his bow, silent and swift, and one of the riders fell back with a cry. The others ducked for cover, as the air filled with the crack of gunfire and the sharp hiss of arrows. Then everything went quiet. Only the echo of the shots remained, bouncing off the canyon walls. She waited, trembling, eyes fixed on the ridge. The sun slipped behind the rocks, painting the land in shadow. Finally, she saw him climbing down, slow but steady, his bow still in hand. He was alive. When he reached the cave, his eyes met hers. "I'll come again," he said softly. "Next time, they won't stop at me." Her throat tightened. "What do you mean?" "They'll bring soldiers," he said. "And when they do, they won't care who they kill." She looked at him, her heart heavy with fear and confusion. The world outside had turned into a storm she could no longer control. The man her family hunted had become her only truth, and the line between enemy and savior was fading faster than the light in the canyon. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the riders regrouped. The smoke of gunpowder still clinging to their clothes, their vengeance burning hotter than ever. Night settled over the canyon like a lid on a boiling pot, and the two of them listened to the wind drag grit across the rock. The small fire he had risked earlier was long dead, smothered with damp sand, leaving only the smell of smoke and pine sap on her hands. From the cave mouth, she could just make out the crooked line of cottonwoods along the stream. Every time a branch moved, her nerves jumped. He sat a few steps away, silent, mending a bowstring with sinew, his fingers steady in the dark. She watched the way he worked, no wasted motion, no sound. It reminded her how many nights he must have lived like this, a heartbeat away from danger. She thought of her father's words around the ranch table, of justice and the rope, and felt them fall apart like weathered bark. When the moon rose, he finally spoke. "You should be on the road by dawn," he said. "Go east, keep to the wash, and do not look back." She wanted to ask what would happen to him if she left, but the question tasted selfish. He had saved her. He had guided her. Yet leaving felt like betrayal, not because of a promise, but because of the truth she had seen in his eyes. "They are my family," she said softly, "and they are coming for you." He tied off the knot, tested the bowstring with a small pole, and answered, "They are coming for both of us now." The words hung in the air. In the Arizona territory, a woman found traveling with a wanted Apache would be judged without trial. She knew it, and he knew it too. Sleep came to her in short bursts, full of dust and gunfire, and a face half lit by firelight. When she awoke, the sky had barely begun to pale. He was gone from the cave mouth, no sound, no footprints, until the first bend in the rock. She slipped outside and found him kneeling at the stream, washing a strip of cloth darkened by blood. "Your wound," she said, reaching for his shoulder. He moved slightly, not away, not forward, like a wild horse deciding whether to trust a hand. "It is nothing," he said. She saw it was not nothing. The cut from the ridge fight had opened again. She set her jaw and tore the hem from her petticoat, pressing it firm against the skin. He did not wince. The desert had already demanded more pain from him than she could imagine. By mid-morning, they were moving along a deer path that climbed out of the canyon into scrub hills. He kept her behind him, halting often, reading the ground the way her brothers read a ledger. Twice he crouched low, laying his palm on the earth as if feeling for echoes. "Horses," he murmured the second time. "Heavy riders. 7, maybe 8. She pictured her father's jaw clenched tight, his hat pulled low, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if he could will the land to give up its secrets. The posse would be lean now, men who did not shake when they pulled a trigger. The thought chilled her even as the sun burned the back of her neck. They reached a plateau of sandstone dotted with yucca. From there the land rolled down toward a riverbed lined with white bones of fallen cottonwood. He pointed to a split in the cliff across the way. "There," he said. "My people call it the Gate of Wind." His voice held a softness she had not heard before, something like memory. "When the hot months come, the air moves like a river through that place. It hides scent, hides sound." She wanted to ask about the others who once moved through that gate, about mothers and children and old men who could no longer travel fast. Instead she said, "Will they know it too?" He nodded. "The scouts will." The first rifle crack came in the gentle light of noon, the kind that pulls the breath out of your chest before your mind catches up. The shot struck stone and sparked. He pushed her flat and slid with her behind a broken ridge, his body a shield without thought. More shots.
Oh.
The report rolled across the open in waves. She heard a voice she knew call her name, ragged and furious. It was her younger brother, the one who had barely turned of age but insisted on riding with the men. She bit her lip until she tasted iron. If he saw her with the man they chased, nothing could be called back. The fight did not become a fight. He refused it. He pulled her along the ridge, never exposing more than a shoulder to the open ground, counting heartbeats between shots. She saw now how he balanced risk. He could have answered with his bow and made men fall from their saddles, and perhaps he would have enjoyed a brief advantage. Instead, he chose the narrow way past a hanging slab of rock into the split he had called the Gate of Wind. The air did change there. It flowed over them cool and fierce, swallowing the dust and the sound. The gunfire faded behind stone. In the shade of the gate, they stopped to breathe. The walls were close, streaked with black mineral like old tears. He said, "Your brother rides with a man who once traded coffee and sugar with my uncle. The trader sells maps now to soldiers." She blinked. "How do you know that?" He looked at the cliff, not at her. "A child hears more than men want him to hear. The trader talks too much when he drinks." It struck her then that their fates were a tapestry knotted with the same threads. Every cow stolen or calf born in spring, every rumor carried from Fort Lowell, every broken treaty, and every toasted deal in a saloon had brought them all to these narrow stones. They rested only long enough to wet their mouths. The split widened and spilled them into a basin cupped by red cliffs, the bottom sown with coleus and low grass. She thought for a moment that they were safe. Then she saw the glint of brass upon the far rim, not her father's posse this time. Bluecoats. Cavalry patrol with a bugler and a young officer whose mustache looked freshly grown. Her chest went tight. Soldiers did not ask questions first on the frontier. They acted, then filled out reports later. He motioned her toward a stand of brush and lay belly down on a smooth patch of stone, studying the rim. She whispered, "If they box us in, there is no way out." He did not deny it. "That is what the young one thinks," he said, meaning the officer. He learned his field maps from a captain who never sat 3 days without water. He traced a line in the dust with the point of an arrow. "Here is the basin. Here is the riverbed under the crust of clay. If we keep to the shaded side and break the top in one strike, the wet layer will show tracks in a different direction." She stared. "You can make false trails with the river itself," she said. He nodded once. "The land can lie for you, if you respect it." They began the work with care. He loosened thin sheets of sun-baked clay with a flat stone, while she pressed them back over shallow footprints, bending them into place like tiles on a roof. When they finished, the line of prints flowed toward a notch that led nowhere. He took her hand and drew her toward the opposite corner of the basin, where a tumble of boulders hid a narrow cut. "When they follow the wrong way," he said, "we climb." The touch of his hand startled her more than any shot. It felt like a promise he could not afford to make. The soldiers took the bait for a while. Voices floated down. Commands snapped. Then the air split with bugle notes that sent a quiver through her bones. At the sound, a different worry rose to her throat. If the troopers and her father's posse met in this maze of stone, pride would do what bullets had not done yet. The desert was full of graves built from men's need to show they were right. She pictured it in a rush, her father arguing with the young lieutenant, both certain of their claim, both willing to test it with lead. She pressed her palms together and closed her eyes for a heartbeat. They climbed, cut narrowed until her skirt snagged on thorn and shredded, until her boots slipped on loose shale. Twice, he loaned her strength with a forearm locked to a ledge, his own breath ragged now. When they reached a shelf high enough to see the sky clean again, she looked back and saw dust boiling at the basin floor. The cavalry had realized their mistake. They were spreading, pushing horses upslope. Far off, a second smear of dust told her that her father's men were circling, 2 hunts converging. If they closed around this ridge, there would be no gate of wind, no river trick, no prayer that could keep the hot metal from finding a body. He led her into a cave no larger than a wagon. The light inside held the stale smell of old fires. Char made a circle on the ground, ghost of meals shared long ago. On the wall, scratched into soot, she saw a drawing that made her throat ache, a line of figures holding hands beneath a crescent moon. He stood in front of it for a long breath. "My mother's mark," he said. "She brought us here when the soldiers burned our winter camp. We slept side by side and told stories so the night would not swallow us. His voice had gone somewhere fragile. She did not touch him, did not need to. They stayed there, listening. The basin below filled with voices again, then went quiet. A single shot rang, then another much closer. A chunk of rock near the cave mouth spat dust. He motioned her to the back wall. "They saw us," she whispered. He shook his head. "Not yet. They are testing the stone." He lay flat and peered over the lip. "Your father is not with them," he said. She almost sagged with relief, then realized what that meant. The posse was making its own line around the west side. The ring was closing from two directions. Her thoughts drifted toward her mother's grave on the slope behind the ranch house. A small cross hammered into the hilltop, where the wind always felt cooler than the valley below. She tried to remember the words her mother had used when the world felt cruel. "Have courage where you can, and mercy where you cannot." She wondered what mercy would look like in a world that had shrunk to a cave in a ledge, and men with rifles crawling up the hill. He reached into a pouch and drew out a small pendant carved from bone. The shape was simple, a feather with a notch. "For breath," he said, placing it in her hand. "My sister wore it when she ran faster than me." She started to hand it back. He closed her fingers around it gently. "That is safer with you now," he said. The gift felt like a weight and a light at once. She tied it at her throat without thinking, and felt the cool touch against her skin. Below them, a whinny split the air, followed by a string of curses and a thud. One of the soldiers had slipped. She imagined the officer grinding his teeth, feeling the shape of failure gather behind his breastbone. On the west side, faint but growing, came a sound that clawed at the heart of her fear. Her name shouted sharp, then again closer. Her father had found the trail after all. He would climb this ridge with a fury that did not leave room for reason. He turned from the lip and looked at her, and in that look lay the tight knot of the main fight between them and the world. "If I run alone," he said, "I might live to the next sundown. If we run together, we will not make the next bend." She thought of the gate, the river trick, the false tracks, the pendant at her throat. He had done everything a man could do to split the odds. Now the odds demanded a price. She felt a fire rise in her chest that surprised her. "If you leave," she said, "they will not spare me. They will say I chose you." The truth of it rang in the cave's stale air. He studied her with the patience of the land. "What do you choose?" he asked. "The house where you were born, or the road that will never end?" The question did not fit into words like family and outlaw, settler and Apache. It cut through them to the part of her that had always watched storms gather on the horizon, half afraid and half thrilled by the power of them. She opened her mouth, but the answer failed to come. Outside, boots scraped rock. A shadow crossed the cave mouth, then pulled back. A voice called to others. The line of men was there, a few feet of stone away, rifles ready. From the slope below, a new sound rose, one that made every hair on her arms lift. It was not the bugle. It was not her father's voice. It was a chant, low and steady, coming from the far side of the basin. She edged to the rim beside him and followed his gaze. On a distant ridge, 3 figures stood with raised arms, not soldiers and not her father's men. Older people, wrapped in blankets, faces painted with ash. They were singing toward the cave. The cavalry paused. Even the posse slowed, uncertain. He breathed out a word she did not know. "Messengers," he said. "They're asking the wind to carry our steps." The hesitation on the slopes lasted less than a minute, but it changed the air. The young officer shouted for his men to move. Her father yelled a warning that the ridge would crumble if they climbed at once. The two commands tangled. At that same moment, a stone the size of a barrel gave way near the soldier who had slipped earlier. It rolled, struck another slab, and burst into a shower that tumbled toward the basin floor. Men swore and flattened. Horses sidestepped, eyes white. Dust rose dense as smoke. He grabbed her wrist. "Now," he whispered. They backed to the inner wall and slid into a seam she had not noticed before, a crack only a child might dare. The rock pressed her shoulders tight. The world became the scrape of her boots and the sound of his breath just ahead. After a dozen steps, the seam bent and dropped. She would have fallen if his hand had not found hers and guided it to a ledge. Below, a sliver of daylight showed. Freedom or a trap, she could not tell. Behind them, Voices filled the cave they had just left. A soldier's boot scuffed the coal ring. A man cursed at the darkness. Her father's voice cut through, fierce and wounded. He called her name again, a command and a plea. She closed her eyes and felt the bone feather cool against her skin. The choice he had asked of her rose like heat from the stone. The crack widened, the daylight brightened, and a gust blew through, carrying the smell of river mud and willows from somewhere she could not see. They stepped toward the light together as the bugle sounded a new call, as the ridge shuddered under the weight of men, as the messengers on the far rim lifted their voices to the sky. The path ahead bent out of sight. The last thing she heard before the rock swallowed the cave behind them was the sound of her father chambering around and shouting that if anyone moved toward the ledge, he would shoot. The desert held its breath, and the choice hung between one step and the next. The light that seeped through the crack was narrow, but bright enough to guide them forward. The air smelled damp, heavy with the scent of hidden water and earth that hadn't seen the sun in ages. He led the way with quiet precision, his hand brushing the rock wall as if the stone itself whispered directions. She followed close, her breath shallow, her heart pounding from the gunfire that still echoed faintly behind them. The path twisted and narrowed until they had to move sideways, scraping against rough walls that tore at her sleeves. When they finally emerged, they found themselves standing on a ledge above a dry ravine. The canyon stretched out ahead, vast and silent, the colors of sunset bleeding into the desert sky. For a moment it felt like the world was holding its breath. She turned to him, her voice shaking. "Do you think they saw where we went?" He looked out over the ridges, scanning every ripple of light and shadow. "Not yet," he said. "But they will." Below them, the ground bore old tracks, some from deer, some from horses, and others she didn't recognize. He crouched low, touching the dust, reading the signs. "This was a trail once," he murmured. "Long before your people built their fences. It leads to the Valley of Stones." "The Valley of Stones?" she repeated. He nodded slowly. "A place where the wind hides your scent, and the rocks confuse the tracks. It's where my father taught me to walk without leaving a shadow." Something about the way he said it made her chest tighten. He wasn't just running to survive. He was running through the ghosts of his past, through the land that still remembered his people. She realized that each turn they took, each canyon they crossed, wasn't random. It was tracing memories, following the steps of those who came before him. But the sound of distant hoofbeats broke that fragile quiet. The riders were closer now. She could hear the rhythm, steady and cruel, growing louder with each passing moment. He motioned for her to move, and they descended the slope quickly, sliding down loose sand and rock. The air was dry, full of grit. Every breath felt like swallowing smoke. She stumbled once, and he caught her before she fell, his arm firm around her waist. Their eyes met, and in that brief moment, she saw fear behind his calm fear, not for himself, but for her. They reached the base of the ravine and kept moving. The land twisted into narrow gullies where even the wind seemed to lose its way. Shadows deepened. Coyotes cried, somewhere far off. The sun sank below the hills, leaving streaks of crimson light that looked almost like blood spilled across the sky. He stopped suddenly, his hand raised. "They've split," he said. "Half the riders are coming from the north ridge, the others will circle east." She tried to steady her breath. "What will we do?" "We climb." The cliff ahead looked impossible, jagged, vertical, carved by centuries of storms. But there was no hesitation in him. He started upward, finding handholds where she saw none, moving with the ease of someone born to the stone. She followed every muscle in her body, trembling with effort. Dust fell into her eyes. Her palms burned, and more than once she thought she'd lose her grip. But every time she faltered, she heard his voice, quiet and firm. "Keep moving." Halfway up, a gunshot cracked the silence. A bullet hit the rock inches from her hand, sending shards of stone flying. She gasped, clinging tight. He turned sharply, eyes flashing in the dim light, and shouted, "Move!" Another shot. The echo rolled through the ravine like thunder. Below, she could see faint shapes, riders dismounting, taking cover. Her father's voice carried up faintly through the canyon. It was a sound she had known all her life, full of command and certainty, but now it twisted her heart with fear. They climbed faster. Her arms ached, her legs trembled, and still the shots came. When they reached the top, she collapsed onto the sand, gasping for air. He crouched beside her, scanning the horizon. "We can't stay here," he said. "I'll see our tracks in the morning." "Then where?" she asked, struggling to her feet. He pointed toward the dark line of cliffs in the distance. "There's an old cave at the edge of the valley. My people called it the place where the wind sleeps." They moved under the cover of night, guided by starlight and instinct. The desert stretched around them like an ocean of shadow. Her mind was heavy with thoughts of her father and brothers. She could picture them below, cursing the ground, vowing revenge. But she could also picture the grief that would come when they realized she was gonna not taken but gone of her own will. As they neared the cliffs, the air grew cooler. She could feel the pull of exhaustion dragging at her limbs, yet her senses stayed sharp. Every noise felt magnified: the scrape of his boots on rock, the whistle of the wind through the brush, the distant cry of an owl. They reached the cave just before dawn. Inside, it was dark and quiet, the kind of quiet that felt alive. She sat near the entrance, staring out at the pale light spreading over the desert. He stayed standing, watching the horizon. "You could still go back," he said finally, without turning. "If you leave now, you might reach them before the sun is high." She looked at him, her voice low. "And tell them what? That the man they want to hang saved me twice? That everything they believe about you is wrong?" He said nothing. Silence was heavier than words. She stood and stepped closer. "If they kill you, nothing will change. They'll just find another name to hate." He turned to her then, his expression unreadable. "And what if I stay hidden? What if I let them take the land, the water, the mountains? Will that change anything?" Her throat tightened. "Maybe not. But maybe mercy has to start somewhere." The first light of morning touched his face, and she saw something in his eyes, a weariness so deep it felt ancient. "Mercy," he repeated quietly as if testing the word. "The land remembers everything. Even mercy leaves a scar." They stayed in silence for a long while. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the faint sound of hooves across the valley. The riders were back on the trail. He moved quickly, gathering what little they had. "They found us," he said. "We moved before they reached the ridge." They slipped through a narrow path behind the cave that led down into another canyon, one she hadn't noticed before. The air was colder here, the walls high and slick. At the bottom, a thin stream ran between stones. It glittered faintly in the morning light, but as they followed it, she heard something ahead, a metallic clatter, the sound of reins, a man's voice. He froze, raising his hand. She knew before she saw them. Soldiers, not her father's men this time, but cavalry scouts with rifles drawn. He motioned for her to stay low, his hand on the handle of his knife. The soldiers hadn't seen them yet, but the sound of water masked nothing. One of the men turned, eyes catching movement. "There." 8. Everything erupted at once. Shots fired. The echo was deafening in the narrow canyon. Pushed her behind a boulder, returning fire with a bow so swift she barely saw the motion. Arrows struck stone and wood. Horses reared, the soldiers advanced. She could hear her pulse pounding in her ears. She wanted to scream, to beg them to stop, but fear locked her throat. He reached for another arrow, his movement steady even under fire. One of the soldiers fell. Another shouted orders. Psst. The noise drew attention from farther off, distant riders charging in from the ridge. Her father's men. The sound of hooves and gunfire mixed into chaos. Dust filled the air. She could see flashes of metal, the shapes of men shouting through the haze. Somewhere in that storm, her father's voice rose again. "Let her go," he bellowed, "and you die quick." She turned to him, panic in her eyes. "They'll kill you." He looked at her with a calm that chilled her blood. They already decided that. Before she could answer, another bullet struck near his foot, sending a spray of rock upward. Grabbed her hand and pulled her deeper into the canyon. The sound behind them grew louder: shouts, gunfire, horses screaming. The path ahead narrowed again, twisting through jagged rock until they reached a dead end. A sheer wall of stone rose before them. He looked up, breathing hard. "There's a way over," he said, "but it's steep." He laced his hands together and looked at her. "Climb," she hesitated. "What about you?" "I'll follow." She stepped onto his hands, feeling the strain of his strength as he lifted her upward.
Ow.
Her fingers found a crack in the stone, then another. She pulled herself higher, dust falling around her. When she reached the ledge, she looked down and froze. He was still below, surrounded by rising dust and shadows moving fast. The riders had found them. Her father's voice echoed through the canyon, closer than ever. "Step away from my daughter." She wanted to scream, to beg for peace, but the words caught in her chest. She could see her father's rifle raised. She could see him bloodied, exhausted, his bow still in his hand, turned slowly to face the men who had hunted him for months. The wind tore through the canyon, carrying the sound of her father's shout and the sharp crack of a gun being cocked. The desert went still, and at that moment, she knew something irreversible was about to happen. The canyon held its breath. The only sound was the wind pushing through the rocks and the low hum of tension that could tear at any second. She stood frozen on the ledge above, her hands clinging to the stone, her eyes locked on the scene below. Her father stood with his rifle raised, jaw clenched, his hat brim casting a dark shadow over his eyes. Across from him stood the man her family had hunted for months, the Apache whose name had filled their nights with anger and their mornings with vengeance. His bow was still in his hand, but the string was slack. He didn't aim, he didn't move. He just looked at her father as if measuring what kind of man would shoot in front of his own daughter. The wind picked up a handful of dust and threw it between them, turning the air hazy. For a moment she thought maybe the land itself wanted to stop what was coming. Her father's voice cut through the silence, rough and steady. "Move aside, girl," he shouted. "It's done enough to this land." From where she stood, she could see both men, one trembling with fury, the other standing like the earth itself. "He saved me," she cried out, her voice cracking. "You're alive because of him." Her father's eyes flicked up at her, his rifle never lowering. "You don't know what you're saying." "I do," she said. "He could have left me to die, but he didn't. He carried me when I couldn't walk. He gave me water when I was bleeding and lost." Her words hung in the air. Even the horses seemed to pause. Her father's men exchanged glances, their fingers tightening on their guns, but not pulling the triggers yet. The Apache took one slow step forward, his voice calm. "Your daughter speaks truth." That single sentence carried more weight than all the gunpowder in the canyon. Her father's jaw worked as if chewing on something he couldn't swallow. "You killed my boy," he said finally, his voice low and heavy. He was 17. The Apache nodded once, the shadow of pain flickering in his eyes. "He came with men who burned our camp. My brother fell that day." His words were not cold, not sharp. They were tired. "I did not know his name, only his rifle." Her father's hand trembled on the gun. For the first time, she saw something she had never imagined she'd see in him doubt. His arm lowered just a little, not much, but enough for the Apache to see. She climbed down from the ledge, scraping her hands on the rough rock, her heart pounding so loud she could barely breathe. When her boots hit the ground, the dust rose around her. She stepped between them, her voice trembling but firm. "If this killing goes on, none of us will have anything left to call home." Her father's eyes softened, but his anger didn't vanish. It was the kind of anger that had lived too long, that had shaped itself into his bones. "You think the world will forgive men like him?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, but someone has to stop before there's nothing left to forgive." The Apache said nothing. He simply watched her, his dark eyes holding something she couldn't name. Gratitude, maybe, or sorrow. Or both. The silence stretched until her father finally looked away. His rifle lowered to his side, the barrel pointing at the ground. He turned to his men, voice rough. "We're done here." One of them spoke up. "Can't just let him go." Her father didn't answer right away. Then without looking back, he said, "He's not the only one who's lost family." It was the closest thing to peace the desert had ever seen. The men hesitated, then slowly began to pull back. The horses turned, hooves thudding softly against the sand. Within moments, the canyon that had been ready to burst into violence fell quiet again. She turned to the Apache. He was still standing there, the light catching the edge of his face. His bow was still in his hand, but he had made no move to defend himself. "They'll come back," she said quietly. He nodded. "They always do." "You could come with us," she said without thinking, though she knew it was impossible. He looked at her with a faint, sad smile. Your world and mine are not the same. For a long time, they stood in silence. The wind carried the scent of mesquite and smoke, and somewhere a hawk cried over the cliffs. He stepped closer, his voice softer now. You saw more than most do. That will change you. She didn't know how to answer. Part of her wanted to tell him that she didn't want to change, that she just wanted her family back and the world to make sense again. But another part of her, the part that had seen the way he fought to live, the way the land spoke through him, knew it already had. Before he turned to leave, he reached into the small leather pouch that hung from his belt. He pulled out a single turquoise stone, smooth and bright even in the fading light. He pressed it into her hand. For the road that remembers you, he said. She looked down at the stone, then back up at him. Will I ever see you again? He shook his head slowly. Not if I do my part right. Then he was gone, moving up the rocks and into the desert shadows, his figure blending into the red and gold of the canyon. She stood there long after he disappeared, her fingers closing around the stone until it warmed in her palm. Her father rode back slowly, stopping beside her. He didn't speak for a long time. The anger that had lived in his eyes for years seemed smaller now, replaced by something quieter. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost gentle. It could have died out here. She looked toward the horizon. So could he. He sighed, a sound full of years of pride and regret. You see things your mother used to see? The good in the wrong places? Maybe she was right, she said softly. He didn't answer. He just looked out at the endless stretch of land, the place that had taken so much and still demanded more. Finally he said, We'll go home. The ride back was long and silent. The sun climbed high, then began to fall again. When the ranch came into view, she felt a weight settle on her chest. It looked smaller somehow, older. The porch where her family had once gathered to talk and laugh now felt like a memory. Her father dismounted first, walking with a limp she hadn't noticed before. She tied her horse and lingered by the fence, staring at the empty field beyond. It was strange how quickly everything could change, how hatred, when so solid, could crumble with a few words and a single act of mercy. Days passed before anyone spoke of that night again. The men who had ridden out with her father didn't return to the subject. The town quieted down. Rumors shifted like wind through dry grass. Some said the Apache had vanished into Mexico. Others said he had been seen near the river, watching the land from afar. But she knew better. She could feel it in the way the wind moved across the plains, in the silence that followed at dusk. The land held his memory like it held the bones of the past, never gone, only hidden. Sometimes, when the evenings turned red and the hills glowed like fire, she would walk to the creek and take out the turquoise stone. She would turn it in her palm and remember the canyon, the gunfire, and the man who carried her through the dark. Her father grew quieter with time. He no longer spoke about revenge or the raids. He started mending fences, fixing roofs, and spending his mornings watching the sunrise instead of planning another hunt. Once he asked her, Do you ever think he'll come back? She smiled faintly. Maybe he already has. In ways we don't see. The world moved on, seasons changed. The desert bloomed after long rains, and the rivers ran full again. She never forgot. The story of that night stayed with her not as something to boast about, but as a reminder that mercy could live even in the harshest places. Years later, travelers passing through the territory would hear whispers of an Apache who no longer fought, who had disappeared into the mountains to live among the stones and the wind. Some said he watched over the settlers from afar. Others said he became part of the land itself. And every time she heard those whispers, her heart would ache in that quiet, unexplainable way, the way it does when you know a part of you is still out there, somewhere beyond the horizon. The desert had taken much from her, but it had also given something back, a truth she could never unlearn. That sometimes enemies were just people carrying different kinds of pain. That peace was not a gift but a choice. And as the sun dipped low over the land, painting the sky in gold and crimson, she stood by the old fence, the turquoise stone warm in her hand, and whispered into the wind the words she never got to say. Thank you for saving my life. Somewhere out in the distance, a hawk cried. The sound echoed through the valley, carried by the same wind that once hid their steps. and for the first time the land felt still, as if it too had found its peace.